I'd like to share with you some differences among ant and termite eating mammals. In particular, I'm going to focus on the pangolin in the genus Monas and the anteater, in particular the giant anteater in the genus Myrmecophaga. So the pangolin here on the left is part of the order Pholidote, and it falls within the mammalian clade Laurasiatheria. It's more closely related to a carnivoran, a cat, dog, giant panda, etc., than it is to other ant-eating mammals. Whereas the anteater, a giant anteater, tree anteater, there are a few different species. These are xenarthrans, and they are closely related to armadillos and sloths. So the extant species are entirely in South America, whereas the pangolin is known, different species in Africa and also in southern Asia. So one of the first things to notice here is that the jaw, the lower jaw in all of these species is really reduced. It's small and spindly. It's unusual for a mammal in that it's not entirely obvious if you look on the cranial side where that jaw joint is. The pangolin has a couple sort of unique features about its lower jaw, in particular this sort of pair of prongs at the anterior end. You don't see that in this long and spindly jaw of a xenarthran anteater. But it does resemble the pangolin in being very gracile, and there really isn't much of a coronoid process on here. The dentary condyle for the upper jaw to articulate with the rest of the skull is right there, and that similar structure on the pangolin is right here, and there's really not much of a coronoid process at all. And of course, if you're eating ants and termites for a living, you don't really need much in the way of bite force. You just need to be able to suck these little critters up into your mouth, and both the pangolin and the anteater can do that very successfully. So this third scan that I have, volume that I have rendered for you, is actually the same specimen as the scan in the middle. It's just that I've segmented out the lower jaws so we can get a better picture of its palate. And this brings me now to one of the differences in a giant anteater and other anteaters, for that matter, compared to the pangolin, and that's the length of this hard palate. So I just want, it's extreme in the giant anteater because the skull is so long, but I want to draw your attention to the position of the internal nares. It's located very far back in the skull of a giant anteater. It's so far back that it approximates the occipital condyles, and if I orient the skull back so you can see it ventrally, that opening of the internal nares is even behind the auditory bullae. Whereas in a pangolin, this also has a fairly long secondary palate here. You can see the maxillae are in the front part of the hard palate. These are the palatine bones. But this comes to an end, at least the secondary palate does, and it opens up into the region that, with all the soft tissue, would be the nasopharynx. That is still quite far anterior to the auditory bulla, one of which is right there. And that, of course, that also reminds me to tell you about the sutures between these various bones in the giant anteater. So just like other mammals, most of this hard palate is comprised of maxilla. Here at the very tip, you can see a little bit of premaxilla there, but most of this bone here is the maxilla. And if I keep going farther and farther back, you can see here a suture with the palatine bone, which comprises an extremely long part of that hard palate. In the pangolin, it's long, but it's much shorter than what you see in the giant anteater. But even behind the palatine bones, you have yet another bone that's contributing to this secondary palate. And this is a feature that's really unique to pangolins. Those are the pterygoid bones. These are contributing to that hard palate, making it even longer in the giant anteater compared to the pangolin, where it also has pterygoid bones down here, but they don't make a floor to that respiratory part of the nasal fossa. So another difference that's worth pointing out relates to the ear region in a pangolin compared to an anteater. And in this pangolin, that's the bulla right there, and it is comprised almost entirely of the ectotympanic bone. So that's the same bone that frames the eardrum itself, which you would be able to see if soft tissue on the skull were present, which of course it is not. But that is the ectotympanic, and you can just see one of the ear ossicles through this external auditory meatus, and that is framing the eardrum. Now, you can also see a bulla in the anteater, but the composition of that bulla is different. The ear region in the giant anteater is comprised of a couple different bones. You can make out here the ectotympanic, and there is one of the ossicles just poking out that you can see through the external auditory meatus, or the entrance into the middle ear. But what you have in addition to that are this large part of the bulla that is mostly comprised of an entotympanic ossification, and that grades into the pterygoids that are contributing to this hard palate. So it's a very different ear region as well. Another difference between the xenarthran anteater and the pangolin, the Laurasiatherian pholidote, here all the way on the left, concerns the position of the jaw joint on the skull. And these animals are both unusual in that the jaw joint on the skull it's not obvious. Usually that's one of the most obvious joints you can see in a skeleton, the jaw joint. But in the case of a pangolin, it's this thing right there. And I don't know if you can appreciate that. I'll zoom out a bit so I hope it's reasonably clear. This lower jaw has been displaced a little bit, so what you would expect is that the tip of the jaw should actually be fairly close to the anterior tip of the skull. So this whole lower jaw has been somewhat displaced posteriorly, and this articular surface of the lower jaw should, in life, connect here, and it's a very poorly defined articular surface. Again, very unusual for mammals, which typically have really strong jaw closing muscles and correspondingly very strong bite force, and that's just not the case with these ant and termite eating species. In the case of the giant anteater, the region where the lower jaw connects to the rest of the skull is right in here, and it's not a well-defined articular surface to that joint. These jaws were disarticulated in this specimen I have rendered for you in the middle. So you don't really see the position of the jaw joint based on where these lower jaws are situated, but you do see the jaw joint located here.